All right. Dave, Keith, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Yeah,
For
hey
sure.
Patrick.
So Keith, we're so familiar with seeing religious horror movies take on the myths of like Christian stories and Catholic stories, and obviously this is not that. So I was curious if when you were approaching like the visual style and the visual language of the movie, if there were things that you aimed to distinguish yourself from those typical like Christian Catholic myths that we typically see of demons and whatnot.
Yeah, I think it's some ways yes, and in other ways no. I really did kind of approach it as it was going to be a horror film through a Jewish lens in terms of like the community we're in and the language and the mythology and the kind of all that stuff. But I wanted it to feel like a horror film and kind of have the sort of tropes that you might expect as kind of an easy entry into it. So for me, in some ways, it was me thinking, okay, it's a chance to do like a Jewish exorcist and kind of so a lot of the visual kind of style it both came from me being influenced by certain things. When there's some films you see at a certain age that just kind of lodge themselves in your brain, and for me it was stuff like Angel Heart, and it was stuff like Jacob's Ladder, and it was just a certain aesthetic and a feel and a look to those films that I wanted to replicate in some ways, that I also thought would be true to, oh yeah, this is a religious horror film, it just happens to be Jewish, but it's going to have that sort of atmosphere.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Our next question comes from Henrik. You're on mute, Henrik.
How about now? Sorry about that, guys.
No worries.
So can you, I know you wanted to do this the proper way, and actually with permits, and you were out there, shooting it like a regular film crew and not guerrilla style. Can you talk about the cooperation from the community, and also if you can talk about the house, the location of, not the location, but the house, and that if that was a real house?
Yeah. So yes, it was important to me for the film to feel cinematically like what I was going for in terms of the aesthetics of, I wanted a lot of dolly shots. I wanted steady cam. I wanted it to have that omniscient sort of that view that's very cinematic. And so that meant putting a dolly track down a street in Williamsburg in the community. So it meant having a real presence there. And the community, well, I think most of all, they were just really curious. It wasn't so much that they cared about the movie we're making. It wasn't like they were offended, like, oh, this could be a Jewish horror film or whatever this was. It was more just like, why are you filming here? Like, why are you here? Why are you bothering? It was 2:30 in the morning when we're filming a lot of it, and Dave could talk about some of those scenes. And in terms of the house, it was a real house. It was important to me. We talked about building a set, and obviously you can float walls on the set, and it's easier to move the camera around. But there's a certain kind of feel in a house that has a history, where there's something baked into the walls. And that house that we filmed in belonged to one of our executive producers who had bought it and was going to remodel it. And we just luckily got in before, but it had belonged to an elderly Jewish woman who had died at the house a few months before we moved into it. And so there was something just there that you could feel and sense. It made it harder. We had to build trolley tracks in very tight spaces, and we're all piled up on each other. But it really added a lot of authenticity to it.
Our next question comes from Boris. You're on mute, Boris.
Hi, sorry. Hello, Dave. Hello, Kev. I have discovered your movie a few months ago and found it really good and scary. What can you tell us about your collaboration with Jason Blum?
Oh, sure. So the film itself was made independently, and it was something that we made with Boulder Light Productions and Angry Adam Productions, and it was entirely independently financed and filmed in New York. I think when we were making it, we had kind of no idea what would come of it and kind of where it would go. And we were lucky enough to get it into the Toronto International Film Festival where it had its premiere. And it was shortly after that Blumhouse had seen the film. And so they saw it there after TIFF and were big fans of it. And so that's how we kind of met them. And for myself in particular, started working with them.
Thank you.
Yes, definitely.
Our next question comes from Kelly.
Hi, guys.
Hey.
Hi there.
Hi. Dave, your character is quite emotional and troubled. Where did you draw from for that?
Well, to build the character of Yakov, I wanted to first understand the community that he came from. And so I spent a lot of time researching the Hasidic community and meeting a lot of people who had one foot in or out of the community in various stages of belonging to the community or having left the community or trying to leave the community and the struggles that entails. And then as well, Yakov is going through the sorts of traumas that I think many people go through, myself included. So in that way, I just tried to delve into the loneliness associated with giving up a life to find a new life and to really understand the courage that Yakov needed to take such a bold step to take the journey of discovering who he was. And that was a journey that Yakov was on, and that a journey that I had to undertake to understand who Yakov was. And, when we were filming, I spent a lot of time alone in the apartment I was staying in, which was sort of sparsely furnished, and that gave me the space I needed to work on my dialect and on the role and study the script, but also to just sort of sit in that loneliness and try to understand what Yakov was going through. I think a lot of times when people find themselves alone, they seek to fill that silence with music or television or films. They distract themselves in one way or another. And here Yakov is in this house surrounded by his demons and surrounded by his community and the things he needs to confront, the ticking of the clock grinding at his ears. And so I tried to really live in that sort of loneliness to understand, what does someone hear when there's nothing to hear? What does the ticking of that clock mean to you when, as an actor, when you don't have another actor to work with and all the time, we're forced to listen to ourselves and to our surroundings. And I tried to really not run from those fears that define me as a person, but encourage them and foster them and use them for Keith's film.
Oh, fantastic answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next question comes from Karen.
Hey, thank you. I also wanted to ask you both about creating the physicality for the character and what that experience was like of maybe doing the action sequences and really creating the stunts for the film as well.
Yeah, I can talk about, it's interesting when I wrote the script and we had these sequences that were going to involve a lot of physical sort of action. It was one thing to write them and to be like, hey, I'm going to really push it. I'm going to make this is going to be in my head. I was like, this guy's going through a ton of emotional torment, but also this kind of physical manifestation of it. And it's one thing to write it. And it's of course, another thing to actually act it out. In particular, there's a sequence where Yakov leaves the apartment and has a very sort of physical encounter on the sidewalk. And, we had been prepping for that. I think that was the last thing we shot, and we were prepping for that for a long time. And a part of it was just getting ready for just the physicality of it. In particular, it was freezing. It was freezing. It was the middle of the night. And it was really Dave both figuratively throwing himself into this performance and literally throwing himself into the performance. Dave, you can talk about kind of how grueling that was.
Yeah, well, it's funny because it was the last thing that we filmed, but also the first night that I was in New York, I came to the set to meet up with Keith and our cinematographer, and they were walking through that that section. So we had a chance to really talk about it. And if I remember correctly, in the script, it talks a lot about Yaakov's hands cramping up and being the first thing to kind of take hold. But then we started talking about, well, how does the rest of Yaakov's body fail? And over the course of the next month and a half, I mean, we talked about it exhaustively of at which moments exactly do different parts of Yaakov fall apart. And we came up with the idea that if Yaakov's hands are not functioning, then when his body fails and he hits the ground, he would actually end up, in an attempt to catch himself, end up punching the concrete. And so that became really important to me. And we figured out that, okay, when Yaakov needs to have his hand wrapped and be bloodied and all the scenes that follow after that. So luckily we had really sort of thought that out, and Keith and I had really talked about it a lot so that we were able to keep the continuity going, even though we were filming really out of order. And, you know, as far as the characterization of the movement of the character, I just tried to meet as many people as I could and watch as many people on the street and try to understand how people hold themselves, how people walk. I think at a couple points I took hands behind the back, which is something I had seen a lot of people in the community do, and just really trying to absorb as much as possible to bring as much authenticity as possible to the character.
Thank you very much.
Our next question comes from Joseph.
Thank you, gentlemen. Keith and David. Keith, first off, in an age where we see so many Marvel movies that are about a hero's journey, The Vigil is about a spiritual journey. How tough was it for you to craft that in such a way that it has a very universal appeal, especially when you're shooting that and telling a story within the Hasidic community? And for you, Dave, in going through the process, even though the film was shot out of sequence, given the nature of the film, when you had finished it and finally seen it, because it's such an epic quest of the soul, did you find yourself changed in any beliefs or thoughts you might have had personally?
Yeah, I'll say that in terms of like the writing of it, it was, I wanted it to be universal. You know, it was one of those things where when I was describing it, it was always a horror film through a Jewish lens. It was a horror film first. So the big piece of it was this sort of, you know, the concept of a dark night of the soul, of confronting something, in this case, like this very personal sort of demon that's manifest. And I felt like that's universal. That regardless of the Jewish lens, regardless of the Yiddish and the kind of the Hebrew prayers and some of the ritual aspects of it, that it was important that the core of what's happening to Yaakov, a man who's struggling to face both guilt for something that happened in his past that he's having trouble getting over, but also it kind of inherited trauma in a community, in a neighborhood, in a family, and then in an individual. And how I think that's a universal thing. That's something that everybody faces. For me, it was very interesting to kind of explore how something so short of a time frame, something that's maybe 20 seconds long, can send ripple effects through the rest of your life that not only can you really never get over, but the key to overcoming them, so to speak, was to learn to live with them. And that was the position that Yaakov was in. That again, it was like, this is it's a spiritual, psychological sort of thing that I feel like is very universal, even though we're telling it through the framework of this particular faith and this particular community.
Yeah, and you know, I'm definitely the type of person who considers himself a realist. And, you know, a friend might come to me and say, oh yeah, there's a ghost in my house. And I'll go, okay, yeah, sure. Is there a ghost in your house, or are you having some electrical problems or something like that? But I think the truth is that, you know, magical things happen all around us all the time. And I felt it necessary to invoke some of these magical creatures that exist in our world to get through the filming of this project, to make this film, you know, everything it could be. I felt it necessary to believe that. And so did it change me over time? I think so, because you can't invoke magic when you need it. and then pretend it's not there when you don't need it. So the fact that, you know, anyone who was on that set will tell you there was a very special energy going around. And, you know, did we know that the vigil would turn into what it was going to be? No, but I can tell you that when that many people get together with a common goal and everyone is focused and everyone feels the importance and the gravity of what we're trying to accomplish, you know that something spectacular is happening. And there was magic on that set. So, you know, Yakov's faith, people ask, well, what does he feel at the end? And I wouldn't deign to put words to that, but I think that people struggle with understanding their faith, and people struggle with understanding their faith within the context of their family or their community or their parents' belief. And it's up to all of us to sort of figure out how we feel about that. And Dave Davis, the actor, I'll tell you that I left the vigil far more accepting of the things we can't see in the world.
Thank you.
Next question comes from Patrick.
I think most of us can agree that one of the most uncomfortable moments in the film is Dave, when your character replies to a text message with "okay," period. Because that's totally believable for your character, but it's, you know, egregious in the real world. So I wonder, Dave, you know, after all the research you did among the community, were there other more drastic changes or pieces of advice that you made to the script in collaborating with Keith, or various moments here and there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, the script was so beautiful, and it had so much depth in it. And as we kept exploring, we kept learning new things. And I would come to Keith and say, look at this great phrase I heard, or look at this great characterization, or what do you think of this? And Keith was always very open. I like that. I don't like this. Or why is that important? This would work perfectly in this scene versus another. And I think we really had a lot of fun keeping it in flux and continuing to play with a lot of those things.
Next question comes from Henrik.
So you guys, this is a question for either one of you. What does your film do for the business and the image of the Schoimers?
Dave, you want to take that?
Yeah, I've already had several job offers. So
yeah, no, I think it's interesting because it shines a light in some ways on something on this Watchman sort of role that I don't think people are that familiar with. In the Jewish community, it's relatively common in the sense that when someone passes away, there's somebody watching the body, and it is typically a family member or a friend. What's interesting to me is that in this community, in the more ultra-Orthodox communities, there are people who are paid Schomers, the paid watchmen. So that was always fascinating. Like, you know, and I'd read interviews and, you know, heard interviews with folks who had done this. So it's interesting that it's in some ways shining a light on something I think not many people are familiar with, but isn't relatively that uncommon.
Next question comes from Boris.
Hello, Dave. Which scene in this film was the most difficult for you to play, and why?
Wow, I mean, it's tricky because this is the most difficult performance I've ever had the pleasure of undertaking. It was a challenge as a character study and as a performance piece, and then it had the added difficulty of the multiple languages. So there were many challenges on set, and the physical challenges. But I think for me, the most difficult was the emotional toll. It was finding the sorrow and the fear that Yakov was living inside of, bringing it to the point of feeling like I was almost in personal danger of losing it, and then attempting to keep myself at that point until Keith was ready to film the scene that I thought that emotion needed to be there for. And so as a result, you know, there were moments of great catharsis at yellings of cut, and okay, I think we got it. It was like, okay, I can let go of that feeling for a little while. But living in that sort of pain, it was a prolonged experience, and it was a challenge, but it was so rewarding. Also, you know, in some of the more climactic scenes, the addition of the prayer and the layering of that emotion over top of traditional prayers was an extra challenge, and actually reminded me of my Shakespeare days a little bit, because, you know, I was taught that the words are just the vehicle for the emotion. And in some ways, these Jewish prayers that I've grown up hearing my whole life became the matrix to put all of this work that Keith and I had been doing for months, building this character and this emotion and this story. It became the framework that I could lay that on top of. So that was an interesting challenge, to use these words that I've heard so many times and turn them into something new, a new experience, and that we can all go on with Yaakov.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Next question comes from Kelly.
Okay. Can you explain the creature design behind the demon and any changes that you made versus the mythology?
Sure. So the sort of the demon at the center of this film is a real demon, in the sense that it exists in ancient Jewish writings. It's called a mazik, which means destroyer in Hebrew. In the text that I kind of dug up looking for the mazik and kind of figuring out what this thing would be, all it says is that you should not go into abandoned houses because there could be a mazik in them, and you don't want to run into one of those. There's no description of what it looked like. So when it came time to actually make the thing, it was important to me that it not just be your standard sort of boogeyman, just like some things, you know, with whatever, standing in the shadows, that it had some sort of connection to the themes of the film. So for me, if a big part of the film was trauma and whether to let go of the past and how to move on, then this thing should be the embodiment of always looking backwards, of never looking forward, of never moving on. And so that became part of the design. And it was like, well, how do you make that physically? Well, if you're always looking into the past, what would that physically look like? What would that do to a human body? And so, you know, kind of that's how the design of the thing came about. And the other trick, of course, is with any horror film is, you know, how much do you show? What do you show? It's scarier, of course, when people are envisioning what the thing is and they're only getting glimpses of it. So it was, you know, both designing for the big reveal, because of course you have to show the thing eventually, but at the same time keeping it ambiguous and vague enough that the audience could kind of write onto the thing in terms of their own experience, in terms of what they think they're seeing.
Fantastic.
Although I will add to that, though, that I hadn't seen it at all. I had this imagination of it, and then when I showed up on set on one day when I was able to see what Keith and the team had been working on, and I got the first glimpse of it, it was terrifying. So sometimes actually getting able to see it is terrifying also.
Right, it definitely looks creepy. You did a great job with it.
Thanks.
Our next question comes from Karen.
Even though like the majority of the film is with your character Dave by himself or with limited contact with people, I did want to ask about the scenes where you did have interactions with the other characters, what that experience was like of collaborating with the rest of the cast on set as well.
Well, I mean, you know, it really was a wonderful ensemble in this film. We had a lot of actors who were previously or continued to be members of the community with varying levels of acting experience. And they were such an amazing resource, as well as just wonderful performers. And, you know, the naturalism that they brought to this world, that is a world that they belong to in some ways, was really a treat and a pleasure as an actor who's, you know, I don't want to say pretending, you know, I like to think I'm bringing more to it than that, but, you know, at the end of the day, let's be honest, an actor pretends. And, you know, so to be around people who didn't need to pretend that much, who didn't need to do as much research as I did, who were living it, that was really a very special experience and a pleasure to do those scenes, as well as working with the wonderful and late Lynn Cohen, who was a spectacular actor. And I mean, she just instantly elevates any scene she's in. And as she was fond of saying, the most important actor in any scene is the other actor. And I really took that to heart with her, because she would say, "You're the most important in this scene." I go, "No, you're the most important in this scene." And you know, that's really a valuable lesson that I'll keep forever. So there were a lot of really wonderful people to play against, as well as the doctor character, who a lot of people don't know was originally played by Keith, which I really enjoyed acting opposite of.
Great, thank you.
Our last question comes from Joseph.
Keith, I wanted to ask, I grew up in a melting pot of a neighborhood that was Jewish, Italian, and German, and there was a Jewish couple that had kind of adopted me. And when the gentleman found out that I liked horror stories, he gave me a copy of a book by Isaac Bashevis Singer, who's an award-winning Jewish author, but here was a collection of horror stories, demon stories, ghost stories that people don't normally associate with him. So I was wondering, how did you go about finding this story and the demon that you just mentioned? And I think what's really brilliant is the fact that with this film, as with a whole bunch of other filmmakers these days, are telling stories that come from different ethnicities and different cultures, which is a big change over what we've usually come to expect for the horror genre. And so, you know, also I wanted to say thank you very much for telling this type of story.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I also have noticed that, and it's exciting that that sort of thing is going on in terms of, I knew I didn't want to tell a story of somebody from outside the community coming into the community and saying, hey, you got a problem here. There's this demon on the loose and you've got to solve it. You know, that sort of, that traditional kind of narrative that we're used to. I wanted to see it from inside the community. And if we're going to go into the community, it's got to be, you know, with, from that perspective, you know, from those characters. You know, the story, it's interesting because in Jewish, I think there's a lot of assumption that there's not that much superstition in Judaism, particularly again, you know, in the more secular world. It's not a common thing. There isn't a hell the same way there is in Christianity. There isn't a devil in the same way in terms of somebody taking souls and sending out demons. It exists in a different mythology, but it exists, and it was a lot of fun to kind of explore it. Particularly in this community where, you know, there are some superstitions that are more solid and kind of more widely held than others. And it just felt fresh. It just felt different. It was like, you know, finding the Mazik, this demon. It wasn't a Dybbuk, which we've seen before, and they've seen movies with Dybbuk's, and it wasn't a Golem, which we've also seen. It just felt like it was something new, something different. And so it was exciting to kind of to dig into that. It was both personal, being Jewish, and kind of uncovering stuff that I didn't even know about before myself. It was kind of like discovering a personal history and a kind of relationship with these stories that are not widely, first of all, they're not widely translated into English, but second of all, they're just not widely told. People just don't know that much about them. So it felt like the vigil was a nice opportunity to kind of expose people to a different mythology than they might be used to.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.